welcome everyone to the Unmuted podcast. My name is Jeff Waldman, and I'm your host of the podcast, also the founder of Scale HR. And as you know, we have brought back this podcast about 2 months ago, and we've been dropping new episodes on a weekly basis on Thursday morning normally, and we talk about all things HR tech, and talent. And the podcast lives on our website at GoScaleHR.com and also on our YouTube channel as well. Okay. And so make sure if you want to go and see all of the new episodes, just hit the subscribe button so then you get notified. And so this topic is actually really interesting. I always say that, I know, but but it is pretty interesting actually. Inclusive leadership for a remote work world, navigating new challenges. And so I know that's a lot to take in, but inclusive leadership is a huge part of what we do here in Canada, and especially Canada. And before I bring in our guest Gabby, I just wanted to share a couple points, with everyone, sort of to kind of frame this conversation a bit. And so I think it goes, without saying that Canada is probably the most diverse country on this planet. And so it's really interesting because we actually have over 450 ethnic or cultural origins. So just think about that. That's pretty impressive. I grew up in Vancouver, and I was fortunate to have gone to school and been friends with many different people from, different parts of the world. And so I think it's important for us to understand that we're a diverse, country. And I think, also that we just passed 40 million people as a population. So we're still a very small country, but this growth has largely been fueled by people coming here, from other countries. And I think obviously that has been a very strong part of our, Canadian cultural identity for, many years, and that's going to continue. And obviously that will be part of our workplaces also, right? And so I know that I've talked about, cultural origin, but there are obviously other groups or people that, associate with different groups, like people with disabilities, and also people who don't identify with a, the male gender. And I say the male gender because that in the past, in the mid 1900s, later 1900s, obviously males made up the lion's share of, the workplaces in terms of, representation. And that's obviously changed quite a bit and will continue to change. And I'm talking about women, transgender, and, so on. So these are populations that are playing a bigger role in our workplaces, and that's going to continue. And I think it's really important that when we dive into this topic with Gabby, is just to understand and just sort of keep in mind that our business environment is extremely diverse. And it's important that when we talk about inclusive leadership and why it's important, so we need to understand that and ensure that inclusive leadership is actually part of our practice. And so with that, I just want to welcome Gabby Zuniga, who I recently got connected with, and she has had a very impressive career in HR, diversity, equity, and inclusion, entrepreneurship, and also tech. Thumbs up on that one. And so we're going to dive into this topic of inclusive leadership. And so, Gabby, I just want to welcome you to the podcast.
No, thank you so much, Jeff. I'm super excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And so before we dive into this whole topic of inclusive leadership, maybe you can just tell us, what you do. And I know that you run sort of a couple different organizations, which I like. And so maybe you want to just sort of give us a sort of overview.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. So, I am an HR person. I have never had any other job than working in organizational development my whole career, like from my first opportunity as a summer student all the way to today. I've always worked in the space. So I worked in organizations as an employee for a long time. 3 years ago, I decided I want to try something new and I'm going to quit my job. And it was a really hard decision to make at the time because it was a great job. I was working at Ernst & Young and I was the diversity, equity, and inclusion leader there for Canada. But I decided I'm going to leave and I'm going to try consulting and just the entrepreneurial space. I love creating things and, I felt like it was the right time. So at that point, I started a full service consulting firm called Inclusive Kind, where really we support organizations on getting onto their diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. So there is no one playbook out there that organizations can say, okay, these are the things that I'm going to do. I think diversity, equity, and inclusion work has to be very context specific and that it really needs to make sense for your organization, who works there, how folks feel about working there, the market that you support. And I try and craft solutions for clients that take all of those pieces into consideration and into account. Because from my experience, folks, when they sometimes start into the D&I journey, can sometimes take all those best practices and apply them. And sometimes that causes more harm than good. So that's Inclusive Kind. And that's really what we do: full service consulting, assessments, training, learning. And then I also, as a spin-off of that, my clients were asking for certain tools that weren't available in the marketplace. So not in the way that they envisioned them. So I created another company called Hear You. It's all interrelated to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it's a platform. So Inclusive Kind of services, and this is more a product where employees could use Hear You to report unfair treatment in the workplace. Anything from small slights that they may be experiencing in the workplace, microaggressions, to really large, serious situations like harassment, discrimination. So employees can use the tool to report unfair treatment into our platform. We scrub that data so that there's, we promise anonymity, and we flip that back to the employer in dashboards and in recommendations and in insights. So we are kind of removing the friction that is created when an employee goes to HR or goes to their manager to report and talk about some of these really difficult things that are happening in the workplace. We know most people, when they do report, there's negative consequences for those employees. Employers, in many cases, it's very hard for them to hear that these things are going on and often dismiss or, gaslight the individual, or, they may even do investigations that are very one-sided. So there's no closure. So what we're trying to do is take that friction away, but also be proactive in giving the employer that information before things fester into an investigation, before you're getting bad reviews on Glassdoor, before people are quitting, before your culture is really impacted. So that's the area that I play in. So it's all D&I, HR, organizational development.
Oh, fantastic. And you're based in Toronto.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we'll post all of your links, and so everybody can obviously contact you and sort of check out your organizations. And so when we first talked about what kind of a topic that we would kind of focus on, obviously we can talk about many,
Yeah.
but the one thing that we sort of landed on was inclusive leadership. And I personally, also being sort of a fellow HR, comrade, and in the industry, this has been a part of my work, but I'm not an expert in this, area at all. And so maybe you can just talk about, what is your definition of inclusive leadership, and why is it important in today's business environment?
Yeah. So, I love a good definition, but before I jump into a definition, I think, inclusive leadership, this topic of inclusive leadership, can be considered from a variety of perspectives, right? So from my experience and working with organization, I see mainly two sides that people come to inclusive leadership. So the one perspective is that when organizations want to do diversity, equity, and inclusion work, um, that work really starts from the very top. So your leadership. So that's where that inclusive leadership piece comes in. Like the people that are going to support this work, it has to start with the CEO, with your leadership team, with the board. So how do we ensure that those folks have the right skills, the right mindset to take that work on? So that is one piece that we look at. But then there's this other piece, and this is, I think, the piece that is more accessible to everyone, that inclusive leadership, the behaviors, the traits that are required to become an inclusive leadership are accessible and are a framework that anyone can use. So a lot of my conversations around inclusive leadership are with the leadership of that organization. But I also think that those skills are transferable and to all levels of folks in the organization, and that there are things that they can all take in order to themselves become more inclusive leaders. So those are the kind of the two sides that I see. And because of that, I think when I think of what does inclusive leadership mean, it means, the definition I use is for when leaders take a proactive approach in trying to create inclusive workplaces. That's what inclusive leadership means in this context.
Okay. And so you mentioned, in your comment there about, certain characteristics. So, I mean, this might be a difficult question, but maybe try to answer. But are there specific qualities, characteristics, behaviors of an inclusive leader? And if there are, what might they be?
Yeah, so there is work that has been done in this space, like from an academic perspective. So, when the Deloittes of the world, Catalyst, Accenture, they've done a lot of work because they are speaking to so many customers and clients. They've come up with, a variety of different traits, behaviors that inclusive leaders have. It's really interesting to note, though, that the academic literature, there isn't a ton that has been done on inclusive leadership. Inclusive leadership is sort of the new wave of leadership. So there's been transformational leader, top-down leadership. Leadership is a huge topic on its own, but inclusive leadership in itself is something newer that in some cases has become more mainstream in the last 4 years. But there are some things that when you look at some of the literature out there, that you could see some traits that are mentioned more often. I would say when Deloitte, I think they have the top 6. Catalyst, I think they also have 6. Everyone sort of likes this kind of package of 6, but which is interesting in itself. But I think one of them is a visible commitment, like making a visible commitment that you believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion is really perceived as a good practice. And what that means is that you're willing to make statements, put yourself out there, not saying that you know it all and that you have the full picture, because no one does have the full picture and know everything, but that you do believe in this and that you are on the journey to learning and building that awareness for yourself. So really that visible commitment, so that your employees, your vendors, your suppliers, your customers see that visible commitment. And you see this with certain companies, like, Ben and Jerry's, very visible as an example, the ice cream company, right? This is important to them, right? So that, definitely is one big thing. And that one leads to accountability. So because they're putting themselves out there in such a visible way, it's also helping them be accountable to that. So those two pieces work hand in hand. Another trait is, courage and vulnerability. This work is not easy. And, I often say, there are many, many, many ways to do diversity, equity, and inclusion work. There is no one right way to do diversity, equity, and inclusion work, but there are wrong ways. to do diversity, equity, and inclusion work.
Right.
So I think that takes a lot of courage to say, I'm going to embark on a path that I may not know a lot about, but I'm going to learn, make mistakes. So that's another really big, important trait. Others are, awareness of your own bias, right? We live in bubbles. All of us are living in bubbles, and knowing that not only is unconscious bias present in all of us, and for good reasons, but the way that we've been socialized throughout our whole lives is giving us this take on the world. And, and recognizing that about ourselves, so important. And how many have I given you? 4. Let me just end with, I think this one that's really important. And I think it's much more something that people can do, because some of these behaviors, traits they're easy to talk about, but they're so hard to action, right? But one, I think that is an important one, but is also, there's something you can do about it, is building your cultural intelligence. Right? It's really recognizing that, we're here in Canada under this context with these social norms about workplaces, but you go to other parts of the world and you quickly realize that what you thought was common knowledge that everyone did is not, and they do something completely different. And having that cultural intelligence and being able to bring yourself up to speed on, in some ways, generalizations about how other parts of the world operate is really, really important.
One thing that you talked about in that is a common theme, and to me, it's always been about open mindset. So it's a very, it's a very general term, but the idea is that if you have a fixed mindset, then you're not, giving, yourself the okay to open your mind to, things that you don't know, things that you thought you knew, but maybe your perspective might be a little biased or skewed, and so on and so on. And it's all under the guise of learning, right? I mean, it's sort of, like, I'm 45 years old. I'll be 45 next week, actually. So I'm still 44. But like, I've been around for a long time, but there's a ton, that I don't know. And if I had a fixed mindset, then I would say, well, I already know everything, so I don't need to learn anymore. But that's false. So my open mindset is saying to me, no, you know a lot, sure, but there's a whole world of, opportunity and learning, and life is one big learning path. And I think what you just talked about is that. And I think that's sort of really important.
Yeah, no, I agree. Having that recognition, right? That the more you learn, the more you realize you have to learn.
Right.
Is
So obviously, with the last couple of years since the pandemic started, we've gone from, more or less a sort of in-person workplace where people, commute into a place to work, to more being virtual, and it's changing. Obviously, it's changing every day. So this virtual hybrid environment, has that changed anything for you in the work you've done with respect to, inclusive leadership? Has that changed at all?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Like, I think, we, for a lot of organizations, it opened up the opportunity to work with more people in different geographical locations, right? So that obviously has been great, but that in itself is added that layer of knowing how to interact with folks from a cultural competence perspective, right? And communication is a huge part. Like, communication is a huge part of inclusion. Choosing the right words, our body language tells people a lot about how open we are about difference. So a lot of that in a hybrid, over Zoom, over Teams, is more difficult, right? So the communication aspect, it has added this, very difficult layer now that we must overcome, because communication in the best of times is difficult. To do this now, and connect with folks this way, definitely is more difficult, especially if your organization took the opportunity to hire across borders and more globally.
Yeah.
Right. So the communication piece is huge. And I think the other piece is, how do you ensure equity of opportunities, of promotions, of the benefits that you're giving to folks when there is such a variety of needs, right? And so that becomes really important. How are you making sure that your performance management process works both for in person and for those folks that work
Yeah.
remotely? So I think absolutely it has added um, a lot of complexity, and that require just your frontline managers to have a new set of skills as well. And that's an angle that is that some of our clients do look at and consider. How do we really focus in on those managers, because we know managers play a huge part in whether on employee engagement, but also on how employees feel about inclusion. Do they feel like,
Yeah.
and fairness, do they feel like they can go to their manager? Do they feel like their manager is evaluating them properly? So that, that's taking inclusive leadership from the top of the organization more to the front line, and making
Mm.
sure that those folks are trained. Uh, you know,
Very interesting point, actually, because I've always believed that it's the frontline manager that actually makes or breaks company. It's not really. Well, obviously, senior leaders, play a huge role in that. But to me, a piece of paper or a strategy that's on a piece of paper mean nothing to me unless you got the, connectedness, the cohesion, the engagement from your people doing, the actual work. So that's really, really important. So obviously, just shifting gears here just a little bit,
yeah.
inclusive leadership obviously is fairly new, as you mentioned, and so with anything new that can be viewed as maybe complicated or complex or unknown, there's going to be myths or thought that may not be totally true, and so are there any I don't know, myths or misconceptions about inclusive leadership that need to be squashed?
Yeah, myths. Well, I think in general, leadership is a bit of a mystery topic for many of us, right? We all often we believe that many of us believe, and I would say that for a long time I probably believed this too, that leaders are born, right? That some people just have a natural ability to bring people together,
Yeah.
and to lead in difficult times and all of that. And I think what I've learned through, doing this work for 25 years, my experience in HR, is really that leaders are not born. That is the biggest myth, and that, the type of leader that you want to be really depends on just how much you want to be that person.
Yeah.
It requires effort, and all of these skills that we've talked about, they're the hardest skills to learn, right? Courage, vulnerability, being open to others' perspectives. All of these skills are so difficult, but because we're not taught how to do those, we think they're innate. But I think that's the biggest myth. We can learn them. You can learn to be a better leader. You can learn to be a more inclusive leader. You can learn to be more open-minded. You can learn how to have a growth mindset. And inclusive leadership falls in that continuum of how we look at leadership in general, and all of it we can all learn to be better on that continuum.
And I think that's a really important thing. Now, a lot of people have, a great deal of bias when it comes to, like, if you ask them to what makes a great leader, and then, back in the day when I was starting out my career, people would always say, well, the ability to communicate, clearly, or, persuasion, or, and that things like that, and it always led to something about personality, like extroversion, and I'm a very extroverted person. That's just my natural state, but that doesn't mean that I can be a great leader. I can be, the worst leader on the planet and still be
Yeah.
extroverted. So, and I know a lot of people, that are introverted as a natural state, and they are, the best leaders I've ever seen. So, so that's really important. I think that's a myth that needs to be squashed. Now, I do want to get into some actual, specific practices and tactics and strategies. But before we get there, do you have an example of an organization, you can name them if you want, you don't have to, who've done really well in terms of sort of implementing inclusive, leadership practices?
Yeah. Look, I think DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, a lot of people have been doing this work for a long, long time. Like I used to work at Ernst & Young, for example, and they'd have been on this journey to do this work for over 30 years.
Yeah,
Right? When you think of the banks, when you think of
true.
TD, when you think of a lot of the consulting firms, and, these are for-profit organizations. On the nonprofit side, there's lots of organizations who have always had this ethos of social justice, equity. So, this work got, hit the headlines after the murder of George Floyd, and there in May 2020, and it got a lot of attention. And there was a lot of effort being flowed into DEI work. But if you
Yeah,
look at the headlines today, if you read, especially around what's happening in tech, a lot of people are saying like, the first people out are the diverse hires, as they call them, and
right.
there isn't that commitment to this, right? So now we're seeing the ebb, the pulling back. So I think the organizations that do this work are the ones that see this as a journey with no destination, and that they are going to continuously invest. So that is an example of organizations doing it well, and where inclusive leadership is one piece of all of the things that they are doing to create an inclusive environment. They're not in it for the short haul, they're in it for the long haul. And that really, I think, is what separates the organizations that are doing this well and those that are not, um, in my opinion.
I totally agree with that. And actually, I was part of my question. I was kind of hoping that you would sort of not name someone because I think it that it is a marathon. It's a marathon race, and it's not a sprint.
No.
It's a marathon, race. And I think part of the issue is I was pretty critical of it. Obviously when COVID hit, was that a lot of organizations were and I hate to say this, but um, they were looking at it more of a PR marketing thing to say, look, we did A. And so that's why I always ask about outcomes. Obviously you're doing something, for a reason. And so when I asked them, well, why are you doing this? Right. And they really had no answer for me other than because it's the right thing to do, which is fine. Or we want to improve our diversity, right? And I said, okay, so that's great, but this is like an isolated thing, program, strategy, what have you. I said, so what's after that? What's next? Like, what do you change internally in your organization to change hearts and minds, change your practices, and then it just falls apart. It's just dead silent. And so these organizations that go through these longer journeys, are there specific noticeable impacts or outcomes that they typically see from doing this work?
Absolutely. Like the organizations that have been working on this for a long periods of time, like the brand recognition is huge, right? When you think of some of these larger organizations that have been on this, you know, their people recognize them as being more inclusive, right? Because they're not only focused on kind of the employee piece of it, this also they're focused on embedding it in all different parts of their
Yeah.
organization, right? So just as an example, I was just at Manulife actually about 2 weeks ago. They had a supplier diversity day. So,
Oh,
this is very, this is different. This is changing the conversation. So, supplier diversity has been around again for 20, 30 years. Some organizations have been doing this forever, but
Yeah.
it got raised, and it's an area that organizations are looking at. But a Manulife has a whole team of folks right now working on how to diversify their supply chains. They know they don't want to only play with the big organizations and bringing them as suppliers. They want to support Black businesses. They want to support Indigenous led businesses. They want to support women-owned businesses.
Mm-hmm.
And they are, being very strategic about the goals that they're setting around their spend. Like I believe they said, they wanted of their whole, the Manulife's huge. It's a global organization. And they spend billions of dollars in suppliers, billions of dollars.
Yeah.
And, they want, to grow to 5-6% of all of their spend to be spent on suppliers, on diverse suppliers. That to me is incredible. Because not only are they living their values in that they're supporting the communities in which they are
Right.
in, but they are seeing the benefits of working with these more diverse businesses and tapping into, pools of, when we were there, we heard about, a recruitment company that they were working with that was us, bringing them in a supply of diverse talent. So the benefits are huge from a brand recognition, customers, people vote with their dollars, and they're able to tap into different communities, different customer bases. People want to work for them, right? There's it's a noticeable difference when you walk into an organization that is focused on this, rather than with an organization that is kept their head in the sand.
So as people, obviously being human beings, I mean, whether you're a candidate, a job candidate, a prospect, or an actual employee, there's that sort of emotional connection that you have with an organization, that actually believes in something and does something, practices something that you actually believe in. That's a value of yours, and so that's a really powerful thing. So obviously there are a lot of organizations out there, and I primarily work with sort of SMBs, so smaller mid-sized companies,
Yeah.
because they have less money to be able to, and also and people to sort of focus on certain things. But what can organizations do if they want to start down this inclusive leadership journey to start? Is there something like a roadmap or recommendations, tips that you
Yeah.
have?
I always say to organizations, like, you want to put yourself into a situation where you are being proactive rather than reactive. Okay. And that is applicable for an organization that is 10 people or hundreds of thousands of people. And so you want to be in the driver's seat. If you're going to get into DEI because of a PR firestorm, your tactics and what you're going to do and what you're going to be forced to do is very different than if you are at the wheel in this. So think of, you are doing a lot in an organization, whether it's small or medium size, and you may not have a lot of resources from, lots of HR people. You may not be able to hire a D&I person. Most organizations under 1,000 don't have one.
You don't have one,
But,
right? No.
be really thoughtful around what are you going to do. There's so much information out there about how to start a D&I journey. Always start with looking at your organization and your context, because I'm sure there are some things that you are doing that you're doing well, and then there are opportunities. So look at your data. If you can hire a consultant, the fee might be, you may pay for, some cost up front, absolutely, but those are well spent dollars, because a good consultant is going to help you create a roadmap where you're not going to need them, but it's going to give you the direction of where you're going.
Yeah.
Don't just enter this space thinking, oh, I'm going to start an ERG for women, when that might not be solving your problem, and it's going to cause more harm than good.
Yeah.
Take the time invest some dollars. There's so many amazing consultants working in this space right now, some that are really specific to tech and small businesses. They don't cost that much, that can at least tell you, for your context, this is how you can, be a part of this. So, definitely do your homework. It's a journey. And be prepared for it to be a long journey. But make that investment up front, because it will pay itself off for organizations.
That's an excellent point. Can you recommend any, I don't know, resources, tools, anything like that? I mean, obviously, online it's just ripe and rich with content and good things just to learn from. But it can be a bit overwhelming, obviously, when we're trying to sift through things. So, do you have any suggestions of maybe specific things that people can sort of look at and go to?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, if folks want to learn more about inclusive leadership for themselves, where are they and what they can do individually? Because we have to remember, this is also a systemic, there's a systemic piece to this, right? Your organization can do things. But if you yourself are listening to this and are saying, I want to become a more inclusive leadership, I would recommend two things. There's this wonderful book. I have it here in front of me. It's called How to Be an Inclusive Leader.
Oh, okay.
By, her name is Jennifer Brown. She has a consulting firm out of New York. She's been doing a lot of this work, and she's one of the few people that has written an excellent, it's a 120-page book that is completely accessible, that anyone can pick up to get onto that journey at the individual level. Highly recommend that book. And also, I'll share the link with you, but Catalyst, so catalyst.org, they are, you may know, they're a think tank, and all they're trying to do is progress women in organizations and in business to higher levels. And they have, Are You an Inclusive Leader quiz.
Oh.
Okay, it's simple. We use it sometimes when we do our training. It's a fun, short quiz that you can do, but it tells you where you are. So if you do it in a way that you want to learn, and you're not going to overinflate your answers, you could do this quiz. It'll take you 10 minutes, and it'll get you thinking about what situations are you confronted with where you can show more inclusive leadership, and then it'll give you some tips. So, having that self-awareness, I think reading that book, I think, will set you off on the course of this journey.
Fantastic. So we'll share the links, so not to worry. So we'll get that. So thank you, for that, Gabby. So I have one last question for you. So, obviously this topic is big. It's huge. It's complicated, and I think you've done an excellent job at sort of, capturing the key parts of this area. If our viewers can learn just one thing about anything that you've talked about today, what would that be?
So DEI in an organization is not going to flourish if you don't have your senior leadership on board.
Yeah. Okay.
So what I would say is, if you are an individual contributor, if you're an HR business partner, and you think this is an important activity, area that your organization needs to get on board with, figure out how to get into that leadership, build your case on why they need to invest in this. It will make all of the difference. Grassroots works to some degree, as long as you get a lot of people, working in that space to force leadership to do that. But as an HR practitioner, you have a lot of influence. This is, we need to do this. It makes good business sense to do this. So figure out, how do you influence, the folks that hold the strings for resources and money, because you will need it. And, you'd be surprised. I guarantee you that they're also thinking about it. They just don't know what to do, and they need someone to help them. So getting that leadership on board will make your life, easier in trying to implement this and trying to do something about it. And
so that's an excellent sort of ending comment. And if anybody needs any help with putting together a business case, you can talk to me, and I'm sure Gabby would, be open and willing, to help as well. But that's really, really important. And I'm glad that you shared that. And so I just want to thank you for being here today. We'll share all of the great tips and links and, things like that. And I just want to say this is actually a really important, part of work. It's not meant to replace the leadership principles that all of our organizations have already been working on. This is just something as a supplement to add on, layer on, and I think that's really, really important. And if you're not on that journey right now, with inclusive leadership, I think now is a perfect time to start. So once again, thank you all. And so once again, the Unmuted podcast is a weekly pre-recorded podcast. So this one will be published probably next month in November, so leading up to our first ever Rethinking Disabilities event, which is taking place on November 30th in Toronto. So, and so once again, the Unmuted podcast, we talk about all things HR, talent, HR tech. You can find us online on our website and our YouTube channel. So, Gabby, thank you very much for being here today.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Really enjoyed it. Audio Jungle.